Fantasy usually gets one thing hilariously wrong. It throws magic, monsters, and giant creatures into a world that still somehow works like a regular forest with regular rules. But if magic shaped life from the beginning, half of those worlds would collapse instantly. The huge predators couldn't find enough food, the magical forests would spiral out of control, and most of the classic monsters would burn through energy faster than they can eat. But logically, a real magical world would run on biology and the general principles that exist in our ecosystems. And once you start looking at magic in that way, a lot of iconic fantasy ideas, which we will look at later in the video, suddenly break. But the pieces that survive become way more fun, I promise. Maybe your massive dragon can exist, but only if the environment is rich enough to feed it. Maybe your glowing forests work, but they need some organism to keep magic from snowballing out of control. Maybe your magical apex predators survive, but only if they're incredibly rare. So let's talk about that world. What does that world logically look like? What thrives? What collapses? What rules show up automatically, whether you want them or not? But before we jump into creatures and ecosystems, here's the fastest possible recap of the necessary information of part 1 of this magnificent miniseries. But feel free to watch part 1 anyways for a more detailed explanation. We treated magic like a natural energy. If it heals, burns, moves matter, reshapes bodies, or warps the environment, then it's doing work. And anything that does work behaves like energy, which means it can be stored, transferred, lost, concentrated, or wasted. Real ecosystems run on energy flow, so producers take energy in, consumers move it around, decomposers recycle it. But most of it leaks away at every step, around 90%. Magic would obviously also use that same structure. Some organisms store or generate magical energy, some feed on it, some break it down so it doesn't overaccumulate and wreck everything. Balance here is just a natural consequence of energy systems trying not to explode or starve. That's the foundation. With that in place, we can finally look at the world itself and ask the real question. If magic evolved alongside actual biological rules, what would creatures, populations, and entire environments logically look like? So in this video, we're not asking what would be sick, we're asking what could actually be sustainable in a magical world. Once you think like that, your dragons, phoenixes, and undead armies suddenly have to obey the same underlying logic as wolves, whales, and fungi. Because spells can bend reality, but bodies still have to deal with heat, mass, oxygen, food, growth, and waste. Populations still follow reproduction, mortality, and resource limits. Ecosystems still have carrying capacities and energy pyramids. But let's start at the creature level first, because that's where fantasy usually starts cheating. Take any magical creature you like, a dragon that breathes fire, a phoenix that resurrects, or a wizard's familiar that can teleport short distances. Every one of those abilities burns logically energy. And luckily, the real world already gives us a frame for how expensive that is. Movement costs organisms fuel. Sprinting costs them even more. Flying costs a ridiculous amount. Keeping a large brain running drains constant energy. Healing tissue is also costly, which is why major injuries knock animals out for long periods, and regenerating whole limbs takes an even more serious investment in calories and time. Now imagine that with magical abilities. Fire breath is essentially a directed flamethrower. Phoenix rebirth is full body reconstruction. A teleport is moving mass across space with no support. Energy is not exactly known for giving out free lunch. Some mechanism in the body has to concentrate and release magical energy, and whatever that mechanism is, it has a budget. So if a dragon lives in your setting and uses fire in combat, that fire is expensive. If you want a dragon that can carpet bomb an army with infinite fire, then something in the environment has to dump an absurd amount of usable energy into that dragon constantly. You can do that, but now the environment must reflect it. Same logic hits magical regeneration. A phoenix turning into ash and reforming a whole body breaks most normal biological timescales. So you can commit to that as a unique and rare phenomenon, maybe tied to a specific magical source. Or you pull it back and say the phoenix doesn't fully turn to ash. It enters a chrysalis-like state, pulls energy from ambient mana, and spends days or weeks rebuilding. Once you start seeing magic as an energy expense, heavily magical creatures can't be everywhere. Either they are rare and dramatic, or the world has to be so absurdly rich in magical energy that the entire environment looks different. And when we are talking about magical creatures, what many fantasy worlds usually ignore is their size. Whenever you scale a creature up, square cube law kicks in. As an animal grows, volume increases faster than its surface area. More volume means more cells, more internal heat, more inertia. Relatively less surface area means less ability to dump heat or move stuff in and out. This is why giant animals in the real world grow slowly, reproduce slowly, and often live in environments that can feed them reliably. Biology prefers smaller, efficient bodies because they're easier to fuel and cool. A kaiju-sized creature stands against that trend by default. Magic can help, sure. You could just say a giant turtle uses magic to lighten its own bones, reinforce ligaments, or vent heat through supernatural channels. But those tricks still consume energy. So titanic creatures exist in a narrow band, but they require enormous input from food or magic. They need special habitats, and they can't pack together densely without wrecking the ecosystem. Once you accept that magical functions cost energy, you can start building anatomy around them. Real biology already has amazing starter templates. Electric eels generate electricity using modified muscle cells arranged into batteries. Bombardier beetles store chemicals in separate chambers and mix them at the last second to fire boiling spray. Deep sea fish grow organs full of bioluminescent bacteria. In a magical world, any creature that regularly channels magic would evolve structures that handle it safely. Think of mana sacs that store energy as their biological battery. Think of tissues that function like capacitors, smoothing out spikes in magical activity. Think of cooling crests or frills whose main job is to radiate off magical waste heat, not just look cool. A fire-breathing wolf might have expanded sinuses lined with heat-resistant membranes, extra blood vessels, and hardened bone ridges. Once you design one or two of these in detail, everything else in your world starts feeling more grounded because the logic repeats. Now think about senses. Animals evolve senses for anything that repeatedly affects survival. Light, heat, sound, chemicals, gravity, magnetic fields. If a signal helps you find food, avoid predators, or locate mates, evolution will go hunting for it. So if magic exists and regularly burns, poisons, nourishes, or reshapes the environment, the organisms that can detect it first do better. Prey that can sense the buildup of a fire spell in the air get a head start. Predators that can follow trails of magical residue find high-value food more efficiently. And if we follow the principles of evolution, those who are able to do that will logically more likely persevere and end up becoming the new norm. That leads to some really fun creature behaviors. Picture a herd animal that never grazes near certain glowing plants, because those plants spike ambient mana to dangerous levels at irregular intervals, which would be a smart mechanism for those plants to develop. In a fantasy world, predator-prey dynamics might be the most interesting shift, but the basic rules would still hold. Predators always sit on a smaller energy budget than their prey. You need many rabbits to support a few foxes. You need a forest full of herbivores to support a handful of big cats. Add magic, and those relationships get sharper, not softer. If a predator hunts more efficiently by using magic, say it can track prey through mana trails, then it risks overhunting its own food supply even faster. That drives its numbers down unless something in the world checks it. So apex magical predators feel rare and intense. They guard huge territories. They only reproduce occasionally. Their young face high mortality unless conditions are ideal. You can push this even further. Maybe dragons regulate themselves by instinctively entering long periods of dormancy, when prey numbers drop below a threshold they can smell. But more about that later. But these details both make sense ecologically and create hooks for stories and cultures that grow around those principles. Reproduction and longevity change the picture again. In our world, long-lived animals tend to reproduce slowly. Elephants, whales, albatrosses. They invest heavily in a small number of offspring and rely on relatively stable environments. They also shape ecosystems simply by existing for so long. If you introduce magical creatures that heal quickly, barely age, or straight up don't die unless killed, then those creatures occupy ecological and social space for an extremely long time. An immortal forest guardian holding the same valley for 10,000 years is more of a landscape feature than a character. Its feeding, its use of magic, its territorial behavior all place long-term pressure on everything around it. You can't then fill the same world with countless other immortals wandering everywhere. The math stops working. Territory runs out, which means conflicts would escalate with no end. Resources get locked under creatures that never step aside. A more coherent version would treat immortals like rare geological events, as in, each one is unusual, and each one marks the world. People build religions, taboos, and trade routes around them. So, at the creature level, the pattern is always the same. Magic abilities cost energy, they need anatomy, they come with trade-offs. The more dramatic the ability, the more specific the environment, or the rarer the organism should be. Now, let's zoom out from individual creatures to whole ecosystems, because this is where the world either comes alive or completely breaks. Energy pyramids still hold even when you add magic. You might boost the base with magical sunlight, mana-saturated plants, or elemental vents pouring out power, but the pyramid shape stays the same. A huge mass of producers at the bottom, fewer herbivores in the middle, and a tiny number of apex predators at the top. That means most of your world will be made up of comparatively low magic life. That's actually more interesting visually and narratively. You can have an ordinary-looking valley where nothing seems special, next to the forest of death. Or you hike through a normal forest, and suddenly the humidity, sound, and smell change in subtle ways, because you just crossed into a magic-rich zone, and your body isn't used to that environment yet. And, as we already indirectly talked about, carrying capacity, the maximum number of organisms an area can support, also still applies. It depends on energy input, water, nutrients, and space. If you cram too many predators into a region, prey populations crash, predators starve, and numbers swing wildly, or the system breaks. So when a fantasy world fills every single region with giant threats, you can treat that in two ways. Either the region is an artificial kill zone maintained by a god, demon, or curse that constantly spawns monsters out of nothing. Those monsters don't belong to the ecosystem. They're more like environmental hazards. Or you redesign the world so that the regions with high predator density are temporary events, magical plagues, rifts, invasions, that everyone in the world is struggling to contain. A stable magical world deserves quieter regions. Areas where monster density is low because resources are limited, or because keystone magical species keep things in check. Niche partitioning adds more texture. In real ecology, species avoid direct competition by specializing. Some feed at night, some by day. Some eat seeds, some eat insects, some eat carrion. In a magical world, magical energy itself becomes one of those niches. Some organisms specialize in absorbing ambient magical energy and turning it into usable energy. Others specialize in ignoring it. A simple, non-magical animal might outcompete an over-designed magical predator in harsh environments where magic is scarce or unstable. That gives you a great reason to keep normal animals and plants everywhere. You might design a forest where only the riverbank glows faintly with mana-rich reeds and strange insects, while higher up the slope, life looks completely mundane. That creates paths of risk and reward and predators and herbivores that depend on magic cluster around those hot zones, while tough, boring generalists rule the rest. And then you have one of my favorite open questions for worlds like this: magical homeostasis. Every stable system has mechanisms that push it back toward a workable range. Body temperature, blood sugar, population sizes, climate patterns, they all have forces pulling them away from extremes. So if magic behaves like energy, something in the world has to keep that energy from spiraling out into endless growth or total depletion. That something doesn't have to be mystical. It can be biological, geological, or a combination. Maybe there are crystal formations that naturally absorb excess magic and shatter when overloaded, releasing it slowly as harmless light. Maybe certain fungi bloom whenever ambient magic rises and digest it down to safe levels. Maybe Leviathan-like creatures in the deep ocean swallow surges of magical current and redistribute it. I'm deliberately not pinning this down too much, because this is the design space where you can get creative in your own setting. What do you think stabilizes magic in your world? A single giant world tree, smaller distributed organisms, or something else entirely? There's one more layer we need to touch, a tiny bit of physics. Anytime energy moves or changes form, some of it ends up as heat. Magic that lifts stones, burns enemies, or heals wounds is moving energy around. That means magical processes have to dump waste heat somewhere. Magical creatures with high output would need serious cooling systems. So you might end up with dragons that spend a lot of time soaking in cold lakes, or flying at night to bleed off heat. Spellcasters whose hands, horns, or tattoos glow, not for dramatic effect, but because those are their radiators. Storage is the other side. High-density energy stored in one place is inherently risky. Batteries explode, chemical tanks leak. Biological tissues that store that much power need reinforcement. That's why mana sacs in creatures might be wrapped in layered cartilage, crystalline bone, and shock-absorbing fluid. The risk of those sacs rupturing under stress gives you organic reasons for magical self-destruct events when monsters are pushed too far. Armorsmiths might learn to carve around those organs when harvesting materials, and botched jobs turn into in-world accidents. Momentum also doesn't just go away because you called it magic. If a spell throws a boulder, something somewhere has to deal with the equal and opposite reaction. Maybe the caster gets pushed backward. Maybe the spell formation anchors into the ground and cracks the stone beneath them. Maybe telekinetic flight works by constantly pushing against the air, leaving turbulent trails that sensitive creatures can follow. You don't need precise equations. You just need enough consistency that whenever you describe a magical effect, you can also describe how the world responds. Once you have all this in your head, creature costs, anatomical adaptations, senses, energy pyramids, carrying capacity, basic physics, you can look back at common fantasy worlds and see where they might leave holes. Take Hyrule from various Zelda games. The world is full of large, aggressive monsters. There are bokoblins on every road, giant stone constructs, linnels roaming around, huge flora, undead, dangerous magic. Villages still function. Travelers wander around with basic gear. For that to hold together ecologically, you'd either need an enormous hidden prey base off-screen, or you treat many of those monsters as non-biological. Summoned entities, cursed constructs linked directly to a central evil force. In other words, they don't eat, they don't reproduce, and they don't participate in the energy pyramid. They pop into existence as gameplay hazards and vanish again. That's valid design for a game, but if you're building a world, you can decide how many of your threats are really part of the food web, and how many are external intrusions. The Witcher's continent does a better job conceptually. Monsters are said to have arrived after the conjunction of the spheres, basically a magical event that dumped new species into the world. Many of them behave like invasive species. They don't fit the existing ecosystem, they outcompete locals, they prey on humans, and they often feel wrong. If you take that seriously, then over long enough time scales, the world should either stabilize around them or collapse. Humans either adapt their settlements, agriculture, and trade routes around monster territories, or those monsters go extinct where they can't find enough food. The fact that witchers exist as specialist predators who get hired to cull monsters kind of hints at that. They're part of an attempt to force a new equilibrium. Where the setting sometimes still breaks is in how long that state of crisis seems to persist, as if the world has been on the edge forever without tipping in either direction. In something like Harry Potter, the failure point moves away from monsters and into everyday magic. Spells appear nearly free. Wizards wave wands for hours, teleport, transform objects, and repair massive structures with no obvious period of recovery. If magic has no energy cost, then either wizards are secretly burning through calories and need to eat a ridiculous amount off-screen, or the environment itself is quietly being drained and we never see the consequences. On the creature side, dragons, acromantulas, hippogriffs, and other magical beasts exist, but the ecology that supports them hides in the background. You never really get a sense of where the food comes from, how thick monster populations are, or how non-magical life interacts with them. For a cozy children's fantasy, that's fine. For a world that wants to feel robust, those gaps matter. So, what would a magical world look like if you tried to respect all these rules, even loosely? The average region would feel pretty normal at first glance. Trees, grass, insects, birds, small mammals. A few magical producers scattered around, plants that glow faintly at night, crystals that hum near fault lines, fungi that only grow where ambient mana seeps out of the ground. Herbivores nibble on those and concentrate magic in their tissues. Predators occasionally target those herbivores for a high-energy meal. You'd still have lots of low magic or even non-magic life filling out the landscape. That gives the world stability. High magic species sit on top of that system rather than replacing it. Then you have the hotspots, places where magical energy pools. Maybe a magical event scarred the land long ago. These areas are dangerous, dense, and weird. Species in those zones lean hard into magic because the energy is available. You get creatures with elaborate mana organs, dense predator hierarchies, parasitic entities that only exist in magic-saturated environments. Think of those zones like coral reefs or tropical rainforests, extremely diverse, full of specialists, and fragile. A single change can trigger cascades. It could be a dead important creature, a new kind of magic pollution, or a careless city tapping that power source. It could lead to forests going feral, weather patterns locking into storms, and creatures migrating out, carrying pieces of that instability into calmer areas. On the opposite side, low magic or anti-magic regions are quiet but harsh. Not much energy flows through, so only tough, simple organisms survive. Magic-heavy species avoid those regions because their abilities barely function there. That makes them perfect refuges for mundane life, and for civilizations that prefer predictability over raw magical power. People in this world behave differently too. Civilizations build near stable magic sources the way we build near fresh water and fertile soil. Villages grow around minor springs of steady magic that recharge simple tools, heal crops, or keep predators at bay. Cities form near major but predictable sources, places where ambient magic is high but well understood. No one sensible plants a town in the middle of a chaotic hotspot where magic spikes randomly. Those areas become temples, forbidden zones, research sites, or end-of-the-world dungeons. Agriculture adapts. Farmers grow mana-tolerant crops near low-level sources, knowing yields jump, but pests also get nastier. And monsters, all those magical creatures, stop feeling like generic filler and start feeling like expressions of their environments. A dragon that lives near a volcanically active mana source behaves differently from one that spends centuries gliding over calm, cold seas. One hoards heat and sleeps in magma chambers. The other absorbs ambient storm magic and thus would be different. The bigger payoff of thinking like this isn't just accuracy. It's that your world starts surprising you in ways that still make sense. When everything plays by a coherent set of rules, twists feel earned. A kingdom that disappears overnight or is facing an existential threat because someone killed what they thought was a random ancient beast, only to learn that beast was the primary stabilizer of regional magic. That hits harder than a wizard did it, with no follow-through. I'm really not trying to suck the fun out of fantasy. I just personally believe that proper reasoning and structure enriches especially more complex magical worlds. Because nobody really likes plot holes or weak world building. But if you can properly explain your world building without having to cheat in a way, then you're doing great. If you're a brave one, feel free to share your ideas and let others or myself be the judge of it in a constructive way, of course. So when you're designing your own magical worlds, or just revisiting your favorites with a more ecological eye, treat magic as part of the food web. Let it feed, flow, pool, rot, and get recycled. Let creatures evolve organs and senses that match the jobs they do. Let predators, prey, and people fight over not just land and food, but over access to magical energy in ways that change landscapes over time. That's when a fantasy setting stops feeling like a stage with props and starts feeling like something that could almost exist somewhere, on a bad day, if reality took like a really weird turn. In the last video, many of you had incredibly unique ideas that I really enjoyed, but you can also let me know if there's a book or a show you liked that really fits into this whole concept. I'll sadly have to take a break next week, but I'll be back with something really cool the week after, so you guys can look forward to that.